Many of you probably will know Ken. He's operated in archaeology for a really, really long time. Very valuable member of the archaeology community in Wales and probably in the UK as well. So he's going to talk to us, he's going to reflect on the work of the former Dyfed Archaeological Trust over its almost 50-year history. And I think you probably, Ken, were there from the beginning. So this is the best person to reflect on this organisation, I think. And you might be aware or might not be that the Dyfed Archaeological Trust, along with the other 3 archaeological trusts in Wales, they merged earlier this year to form HENEB. And for those of you who sometimes ask me, what does HENEB mean? It means monument. I think some other Archaeology Wales, I think, had already taken that one. But, it's a great title for an organisation. But I'd just like to, before you come on, Ken, just say how invaluable your wealth of knowledge and experience has been to archaeology in Wales and I think in the UK, and particularly in Pembrokeshire and Dyfed as well. And I'm really grateful personally for the support and help you've offered me over the time I've worked for the National Park. So Ken, if I can ask you to come up and I'll let you take over.
Okay, there we are. So they were founded in the mid-1970s, the 4 Welsh Archaeological Trusts. I joined Dyfed actually the week before Margaret Thatcher was first elected Prime Minister. So that puts in some sort of perspective. So the trusts were formed in the mid-1970s, not all at the same date, but roughly around 75, 76. And I joined Dyfed, as I said, the week before Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister for the first time. So that puts it in some sort of perspective. And they were founded to cover the whole of Wales, a unified archaeological service for the whole of Wales. And there was concern in the mid-1960s onwards through into 70s that archaeological development was taking place mostly in towns and cities, historic towns and cities with no archaeological intervention whatsoever. Things just being lost. Big developments taking place and nothing being done about it. And so in England, various responses were put forward, and in Wales, the 4 trusts were founded to try and deal with what we then called rescue archaeology. That's just dealing with archaeology which is going to be destroyed by some means, mostly development. And that was a big thing, and it's been successful in Wales for almost 50 years, and it's been the envy of across the border into England, where they haven't had such a unified system at all. It's much more dispersed and done by various either local authorities, national parks, other organisations. So the 4 trusts were Dyfed, Gwynedd, Clwyd Powys, and Glamorgan Gwent. And essentially they cover the whole of Wales. They're based on the 4 counties, the counties that were then established in the mid-1970s. Obviously, those counties changed their names and changed their areas in the mid-1990s, but we stuck with those names anyway. And there we are, and that's the areas of the 4 trusts you see there, Dyfed in the purple colour. And prior to the trusts being formed and established in the mid-70s, archaeology was done quite an ad hoc basis. There was no response to development taking place whatsoever. So things like the M4 motorway constructed across the whole of South Wales, we have no idea what was destroyed as part of that construction work. A lot of archaeology would have been destroyed, but we just don't know. Nothing was done there. And at that time, the archaeological work was being done by universities, by some museums, and by local societies. But there was no coordinated response to development. And so, an overall commission based in Aberystwyth also did some excavation as well, but they weren't set up to do excavation, and so they couldn't quickly respond to development as was being required at the time, where sometimes you have to just drop what you're doing and just go out and do some work, which is discoveries are made or something's happening. And these organisations are just not geared up for doing that. So although excavations at Llandergai there were important, and actually they carried on under the Gwynedd Trust into the later 1970s, 80s, and even into the 1990s as development continued, a really important site. And the other thing is universities, and in this case, Professor Grimes, who was actually born at one of the most eminent archaeologists in the 20th century, born at Pembroke Dock. And there you see him at Dale Fort, but not something you would recommend doing nowadays. And right from day one, important discoveries, amazing discoveries were made. On the left-hand side there, you see a hoard of Bronze Age gold bracelets found in a pipe trench near Llandilo, and it's now #1 on the Historic Environment record. So it was made in the first couple of weeks of the foundation of the Trust in the mid-1970s. And we continue to make these discoveries. This is a Bronze Age burial just outside Carmarthen, made earlier this year. One of the last things that we did as the Dyfed Trust before merging. And here you see a low quarry face and a Bronze Age burial exposed in that quarry face. It just clipped the grave of a burial about 2000 BC. And what you see there is an urn, a Bronze Age urn, it's about so big, with a cremation burial inside it. But interestingly, what it's done is it's replaced an earlier burial. And if you look there, you can see the remains of an earlier inverted urn with a cremation in it as well. And that later one just ripped out that earlier one and replaced it. Very soon after, it was probably put in that first one. And that was just 2 days' work. We just went out there, quickly recorded it as we could. And we're still working on the post-excavation, sorting radiocarbon dates and things. But that's the sort of type of work that still turns up. You suddenly get a phone call saying, we found something, can you come out and do something about it? And that's what we do. And things haven't changed that much in many ways over the 50 years. We still have to get out our planning frames and our planning boards and tapes and draw things as we always have done in archaeology. So they are over 50 years difference, but still the same techniques apply. But the new techniques have come in, as Thomas was saying about the drone surveys. We use them regularly now. 50 years ago, who'd have believed you could have some machines that fly around and take photographs and do 3D images? But we did do things differently there, as a photograph of Professor Grimes shows, but also this one here. I don't think we would work quite so close to cliff tops nowadays. But this is how things have changed, not just how physically we work, but also how our knowledge. 50 years ago, this is 1979, at that time we had only a vague idea of how the general environment was in prehistoric times. So we're siting at Nabhead, an important Mesolithic site, first used about 10,000 years ago, but continued in use probably intermittently over several thousand years. But 10,000 years ago, that sea would have been dry land. This was an inland cliff. We sort of have vague knowledge that was the case, but not specific data. But now we know this is the case. But by the time this site stopped being used by these Mesolithic people, say 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, that would have been the sea. So the environment changed enormously for those people over that 4,000 or 5,000 years, which now we understand. At the time we didn't. In the early years of trusts, if you remember, many of us are old enough to remember, 1970s, early 1980s, unemployment was enormously high, and youth employment was very, very high. And so the Manpower Service Commission established various schemes to try and get people into employment. And the Trust took advantage of those schemes. And in fact, the Glamorgan Gwent Trust were the biggest agency for Manpower Services Commissions in Wales, and it employed 220 people. And that enabled us to excavate on a scale never seen since, basically. So things like big excavations of Roman sites in southeast Wales, perhaps employing 50, 60, 70 people for 2 or 3 years. We just haven't done it since, like that scale. And we took it in Dyfed as well. We also employed Manpower Service Commission schemes. We had about 50, 60 people working on sites. And here, you see, the most beautiful building in Wales, not what was Tesco's and then Wilko's and now is nothing, it's been abandoned. But in fact, the Franciscan Friary at Carmarthen, described in 1536 as the most beautiful building in Wales. And the car doing a rather strange manoeuvre in the foreground is probably over the high altar of that church. And we excavate here probably 3 or 4 years, almost continuously. And before we started, very little idea. We knew vaguely where the friary was in Carmarthen, but not certain. But in fact, we located it. There's a reconstruction drawing showing what it probably looked like. There's again that photograph showing us just how urgent some of this work is. You see, it's just working just in advance of this machine covering over the remains. And interestingly, on the left-hand side, once the fire was dissolved in 1536, some of the buildings burnt down. The stained glass window fell out, which you see being excavated there. But a reconstruction of that window was made on the far left. And that's actually the coat of arms of Rhys ap Thomas, a patron of the church. And he was reputed to be the man who put the final blow to Richard III at Bosworth Field. Extremely powerful landowner in South Wales. And he was buried in the friary. His tomb and his body was removed at dissolution and taken to St. Peter's Church in Carmarthen, where you can still see, well, you still see a tomb, we can't see him, but we created his empty, we found his empty tomb, but that was there he is with a fantastic coat of arms. And as well as excavation, and I say the trust was initially established just to do excavation, rescue excavation, that was the remit. But very quickly we did start to do other things. And one of the things that we did do was establish what was then called a Sites and Monuments Record, we now call a Historic Environment Record. And this was done by the first director of the trust, Don Benson, that established a HR in Oxford, where he was working there. When he moved to Dyfed, took the first job in the mid-70s. One of the first things he did was establish the Historic Environment Record for Dyfed. And he was a great pioneer in computerisation of records as well. But initially it was a paper record, as it would have been, paper sheets, paper maps, and lots and lots of paperwork. I say Don was an innovator, and the Dyfed HR was the first one ever to be computerised anywhere in the world. And we used those machines. It cost £3,500 in 1979 for a computer. Its power is probably 1/10,000th of what you see there. But nevertheless, that's just for the computers. The screen was extra and the keyboard was extra as well. And if you want to know what the term clunky means, you have to listen to this machine, because every minute or so it would go clunk as the floppy drive clunked around. Nowadays, you can get the whole record, the whole of Wales, on your mobile phone. 200,000 records available there on your phone. And other things we did, we started to do aerial photography. Again, not something we had done when first set up, or not envisaged to be done, but we started doing it. And particularly, this was Terry James, who worked for the Trust, was an innovator in aerial photography for the area. And those dry summers, if you remember what they are now, but in those dry summers, early 1980s, lots and lots of archaeological sites were visible, and you see them here showing up in what we call parch marks in those dry summers. And Terry was discovering vast numbers, these really transformed, particularly of these sites, which are these Iron Age defended sites, as one being excavated. really transformed our knowledge about what the Iron Age was like in southwest Wales. Before that, it was just thought we knew about the big hill forts, and that was it. And suddenly we found these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sites scattered across the whole of the landscape. And just a quick whiz through some of our projects. I mean, this is just a selection of, we've probably done, I know I counted up, probably thousands of projects over the past 50 years. Some are big, and some, like the Bronze Age urn I mentioned earlier, that's just 1 or 2 days' work. Sometimes there's several years' work. In this case, Picky Don Benson was keen to look at standing stones. Again, the 1970s, not really understood sites. Any excavation had taken place around standing stones across the UK or across Europe had just been little tiny holes around the stones themselves, and not much was found. And they said, well, these aren't not very interesting sites. But in fact, this is here Stackpole, 1970s, and the Devil's Coit standing stone. And we actually strip a large area around it. You find a standing stone is just a small element of a very, very big site, and perhaps not the most important element, but it's the element that survives, certainly on the surface. But below ground, set up these thousands and thousands and thousands of little stones fanning out from that stone. And that there is the stone being removed, because you want to excavate below it, but also you don't want to be excavating and have a stone fall upon you. Wouldn't be good for publicity. So we moved the stone. In fact, it was again, if you can remember, some of you, at Castle Martin Tank Firing Range, the Panzer Division was based there this summer, German Panzer Division after the Second World War. I think it left in the mid-1990s. But anyway, that's one of their cranes, Panzer cranes, lifting out the standing stone. And below the standing stone, we set up over a burnt-down roundhouse dating to about 1500 BC, with some human remains in the roundhouse. So whether that was a deliberately down roundhouse or was actually accidentally burnt down, which person inside it was died, we don't know. But certainly it was set up around about 1500 BC and continued in use, we now know, for probably 2,000 years as being a site to visit and do things at. And that little hole there is a crouch burial of the Iron Age date, dating to probably 1,500 years after the stone was set up. So a long, long-lived site. And at the top, Gegurthon, which I'll say about a bit more in a second, again, removing the stone so we can excavate below it. And at Gegurthon, not just prehistoric remains are found, was also an early medieval cemetery. And this is another area which we were quite keen to look at, these early medieval cemeteries, which were not really well understood 50 years ago. And now we have a really good idea of what's going on with them. In this particular one, a small cemetery was set up with a central grave surrounded by a timber structure, a nice doorway there. That's what it may have looked like on the left-hand side. Unfortunately, these very acid soils, this is near Aberystwyth, very acid soils in that part of the world, in fact cover most of Wales, means you get the bone just doesn't survive. So this is the grave, and can you make out that dark black line? That's a coffin or a coffin stain, but just enough survived of the wood fibres to get a radiocarbon date, which dates it to probably the 6th century AD. So a nice early medieval cemetery right at the beginning of probably Christianity in this part of the world. Other places where you've got less acid soils, and this is the wind-blown sands of the Pembrokeshire coast, you do get bones surviving. And this again, back to Castle Martin Tank Firing Range, a well-known early medieval cemetery. Excavation took place here in the 1920s, a bit of excavation, so it's well known to be a cemetery site. But unfortunately, around about the year 2000, badgers had got in and made a home in the cemetery, and bringing human bone up to the surface. You see there, scattered around human bone. What happened there is that the MOD, who own the site, made an artificial badger set some distance away and persuaded the badgers to move out. And you have to use peanuts, a little trail of peanuts. Eventually, the badgers move out to their new home, and then you obviously block them off. So this is what survived the early medieval kist cemetery. Kist is these stone-lined graves. This has had the stone stabs removed after it's so exposed to burial. Really, really good bone preservation. But what we did find is that we had lots of these kist graves where the bone had been cleared out simply because they made ideal little badger houses. So the badger get in there and clear out all the human bone and living in the kist graves. But we excavated the most effective part of that. There's still a big chunk of that cemetery still just sits there quite happily, now badger-free. And again, which many of you know this site, St. Patrick's Chapel, again, another early medieval cemetery site, this time threatened by coastal erosion. I won't say much about it, I've talked about this before, but what's really interesting is the earliest bit of the site below the cemetery, the wind-blown sand built up and up and up and up, but the earliest feature of the site was a little oval enclosure about 4 meters across with a central structure, stone-built structure, very low, which had some crosses incised in some of those slabs, but at the end slab, which is this one here, had this little inscription, Dunawek, little drawing of a boat and a wave. It's tiny, it's only that big, the whole thing, but it's caused great excitement. It's Patrick Sims Williams of the Centre of the Institute, the Centre of Advanced Celtic Studies in Aberystwyth has written a report, several-page report about this name. Don is an Irish name. It's a pagan inscription, essentially. So what you've got here may well be a foundation of a pagan Irish foundationist site, or it could be you've got a Christian site which has a bit of heritage crime on it. Well, with Dunawek coming across and write his name on this thing. But Patrick Simeon is convinced it's a pagan inscription, 8th century. And Dunawek, the second element means young or youth or infant, but Don is the pagan Irish god of death. And he's written quite a bit about this, and actually it's based upon a paper written by a German professor from Leipzig. He wrote a 200-page article about the name Don in association with Irish early medieval Ireland. I would have thought it's written in Leipzig in 1945, April 1945. He published that paper about Irish names. He thought he had something more pressing concerns. Anyway, that's what he did. But I can't go into much detail at the moment. It's a really complex trail of thought that Patrick Sims has put forward for this name. But really interesting. It's exciting people right across in the linguistic world. 50 years ago, when we looked at these human remains, skeletons, there wasn't an awful lot you could do with them. You could tell their sex sometimes. Sometimes you weren't sure, but most of the time you could do. As long as you were adults, so children you couldn't do. You could get an idea perhaps of any trauma they have suffered if it's actually on the bones. Sometimes any disease which had effect on the bones. Syphilis is the most common thing you find, which is very distinctive. But otherwise, you couldn't really do an awful lot with them. Nowadays, and this is a field of study advancing at a huge rate, you can do isotopic analysis, you can talk about what their diet was like, whether it's mainly a terrestrial or marine diet and other things. You can look at their environment that they lived in. You can look at their perhaps place of birth, or it's different from their place of death, and possibly where they were born, or at least where they weren't born. You can do ancient DNA now on things, look at family relations. And this is being done at the both at St Patrick's and also the work at the Friary here in Haverfordwest. The Crick Institute in London are looking at the DNA from those burials. You can look at the family relationships where you've got, father, son, father, grandfather, siblings, whatever, in the same cemetery. You can look at whether there's change in that population over time. You can definitely tell the sex of individuals, where it's even for infants. Say again, to some extent, the origins. You can now do scientific dating on the skeletons, all sorts of things into tracing ancient diseases. Interestingly, the ones at St Patrick's, being done by Katie Hamer at UCL, because she's obviously a part of a huge university. One of the researchers in the medical department is interested in ancient diseases, and actually there's a lot of once in St Patrick's Chapel, a lot of children have lots of lesions in the skulls caused by disease, which again this has been looked at actually what that disease is, where we can trace what these diseases are, and by understanding the origins possibly help prevent them in the future. So there's all sorts of spin-offs and other things you can do now, and that's to say that's advancing at such a rate, it's difficult to keep up what the progress is with that sort of side of things. We also looked at Bronze Age round barrows. Huge numbers known across Wales, 3,000 at least, and more being found every day, mostly through aerophotography or geophysical survey or whatever. But interestingly, though we've got 3,000, lots have been excavated in the past, in the 19th century, but actually very few have been scientifically excavated in more recent times. And so, again, this opportunity to look at things. This is one which is being set in by quarrying. It's a massive stone mound, which was a bit daunting to say the least when we arrived there, thinking, what do we, this is after we've taken our vegetation off the top photograph, what do we do with this? How are we going to excavate such an enormous mound? Well, fortunately, there's a rock outcrop, which actually just been encased by stones, which took great to our relief. It was a little tiny burial, Bronze Age burial right on top. More interestingly, site here, which was when we talked to the landowner, the two round barrows here, which when he took over the farm in the 1960s, stood to about 3 or 4 meters high as big round barrows. When we first identified them as such, they were hardly visible. They're in a really aggressive agricultural regime, just be ploughing and just taking them away virtually completely. So we excavated what was left. Interestingly, we did find a central burial, that's the bone, and with it was a jet bead necklace. One of the first, I think the first one found in Wales since the 19th century. Interestingly, we thought it was a cremation burial. It looks like burnt bone, but actually when it's looked at in detail, it was a chopped up body, still been chopped up when it was still articulated, so it hadn't decayed completely. So still flesh on the bones when it had been chopped up. Of a young woman, and then taken, presumably from the original resting place, and the original burial, which was a cremation burial, had been ripped out and replaced by this one. So again, the same as that urn I mentioned earlier, the same thing's happening here. The original burial is being ripped out by presumably new people coming in and replaced by a new burial. And one, again, all environments, these findings everywhere, even on, this is a Mlynedd Archaeoleg. Now, just actually the border between Carmarthenshire and Breconshire runs through the round barrow. We did this site because it was a little walker's cairn was being created by ripping up the stones of the Bronze Age monument. So we moved the cairn, the walker's cairn. We came across the central burial, which that sits upon. It had a huge capping stone, and then below it was what we call a kist burial. And we debated long and hard whether we actually should excavate this burial or just simply leave it, put the capping stone back and leave it. In the end, we decided to excavate it. It was a classic Bronze Age burial, an urn, cremation burial, and flint knives with it. And we did make the right decision. The National Park Bannau Brycheiniog restored the site afterwards, but when we went a couple of years later, in fact, someone had pushed that capping stone to one side and emptied out our backfill completely. And the reason being is a geocaching site. So people are going there to find things, and they obviously thought something was buried beneath that capping stone. So if we hadn't excavated that, all this information just would have been gone and probably scattered. And what we did find at both here and at the one near Cardi I mentioned was that when you actually look at the soils and analyse the soils, the pollen of the soil, it contained vast amounts of meadowsweet pollen, and they were in clumps. So it was a suggestion. What this is that you guys hear is honey. People putting libations of honey in the grave. But in fact, what the clumping suggests actually what you got is flower heads. So they're laying down a bed of meadowsweet in the bottom of the grave before you put your burial in it. Obviously, has great significance, meadowsweet, for these people 4,000 years ago. There's similar things been found in Scotland as well and elsewhere. So meadowsweet has a particular burial significance. And interestingly, that quotation there you see from the Mabinogion, where blood eye wears is actually conjured up from flowers, including the flowers of meadowsweet. So where you're actually looking at this tradition is 3,000 years afterwards, it's still actually meadowsweet still has a significance. We haven't neglected the Romans. So we have a far better understanding now of what was happening, particularly in the Roman military conquest of Wales, which we're looking at here. That's a map just showing all the Roman forts and roads. Bottom left, those who drove down from the east today would have gone over the Whitland bypass in Carmarthenshire, and you would have driven, that's the road there, the Whitland bypass under construction, and this is the Roman road, which the bypass cuts diagonally across. That's it excavated, showing it there. And this is, again, aerophotography has really enhanced our knowledge of these Roman roads. And here you see one surviving as a crop mark running towards the Roman fort near Llandovry, which is just about there. That actually survives. If you go there and look over the hedge there, that, although it shows a crop mark in this dry summer, in fact it survives as a agger, a camber, about that high in the field. It's huge, running across several fields. And as part of this work, we've discovered several more Roman forts across Wales. This one here, found at just outside Llandeilo, Ddiwrnod Park in 2004. Geophysical survey picked it up. It's National Trust property. We did a bit of excavation, and that's a reconstruction of what it may look like. And in the path of conquest, as Roman military moved into West Wales around about 72, 73 AD, they constructed their forts. This is a fort of to take about 4,000 troops. It's a huge military conquest. I mean, very brutal conquest. The troops are called away to the north to deal with the rising in the north. They slighted that fort, as many others in Wales, they just sliced them all. 10 years later, around about 82, 83, they came back to the same places and rebuilt a fort on a slightly smaller fort, about 2,000 troops, but on the same site, and completed the conquest, which was done by about 110, 120. The military conquest of Wales was complete. And this is, just put this in, this is one of Gwyneth's surveys of a Roman fort. I put this in, so it is a fantastic survey. You don't get any better than this, a geographical survey. It's about 3 days' work probably doing that. And what you see there is the classic Roman fort, the 3 ditches, defended ditches, playing card shape. You can see the roads to the fort. You can see the barrack blocks where the troops were stationed. You can see the individual rooms in the barrack blocks. You can see this strange here is the foundation trenches of a granary, and there's a central square, and you can make out little dots of the colonnades that ran around the edge of that square. You don't get a better geophysical survey than this anywhere. It's a fantastic piece of work. So by doing this, we did just virtually every single Roman fort in Wales, but not in urban areas, obviously, but in the open areas. So we actually know the layouts of all these forts, exactly what they're doing there. I mentioned Bronze Age burials, where we have 3,000 plus in Wales. Interesting, when you get into the Iron Age, round about, which is 800 BC through to the 1st century AD, several centuries, several million people have lived and died in Wales, and yet we know burial places are just a handful of them. We just don't find them. And the reason being is always put forward is that these people are being exposed, and the bodies being stripped of flesh by animals and birds, and then you scatter the bones over the fields. And so you don't find burials, apart from odd, unusual ones. But we have a better idea of what those are now. So you have the crouch burial at Stackpole I mentioned earlier in the pit. That's an Iron Age crouch burial with a child by it. And then here at Sgwrs again, I mentioned earlier, Iron Age burials, both cremations and inhumations. But again, just a few. And of course, then we have the chariot burial in Pembrokeshire, found in 2018. It's called a chariot, but we call it a chariot burial, but it should really be a burial with a chariot, because it's a human burial, which just happens to be in this massive grave cut, which is a chariot, buried with all the fittings of a chariot, bridle bits, other things, sword, other weaponry. There's the chariot wheels, and there's sit in the centre of what would be a burial mound. It dates just to the eve of the Roman conquest. Those artefacts there are purely Iron Age style Latin artefacts, no Roman influence whatsoever. A lot of chariot fittings you get elsewhere have some sort of Roman influence. These don't whatsoever. So maybe you're seeing here this person being buried, this high status person being buried almost as an act of trying to assert their identity in the face of the Roman almost certain conquest that's going to happen to them in probably a few years' time. Time to say almost out. Okay, I won't say much about this one, but it's just the variety of sort of work we do. A medieval timber trackway, Borth Bog. Essentially, what you got here, you can see it. Bit of excavation here. You see that line there? That's Borth Bog there, or a bit of it. That's what's called Llangollen Island, and they built a timber trackway across the bog to connect what you might call the mainland to the island. In fact, they obviously start out from that end and this end, because if you look there, they didn't meet in the middle. Called Dogleg. There it is there, surviving. It dates to probably the 10th, 11th century. But what's interesting is that along the bog edge, we discovered lead working of the Roman period. And this is done under the officers of the Roman army and the Roman military lead was one of the reasons they came to Britain, one of the many reasons, but lead was a valuable commodity for the Romans. And so you can see it here, little furnaces, but also that's a retarded growth of the grassland is due to the lead waste, the spore heaps of lead smelting taking place, and that goes for about a kilometre along the bog edge. Huge smelting activity taking place there. When we started out all those years ago, we never even dreamt we'd ever do a project like this. The archaeology descent, conscious objectives during the First World War. This is Cynefranbach waterworks, Bron Archaeoleg, the waterworks to supply Llanelli. It first started off using German prisoners of war, but that wasn't very successful. So they started using conscious objectives to construct this waterworks, which they did. And the station of where it is today is a fish farm now. You can walk past it. And the conscious objectives did leave a big photographic and written and drawing record of their time there. And you see that the photographs of where they lived, the sketches, the cartoons of the people there, really fantastic sort of record of and of course all the War Office records of these people that all survive as well, while they were conscious objectives in the first place. So again, it's nothing we even dreamed we'd be doing this sort of work 50 odd years ago. I just mentioned I won't go so much about these things, but we do all sorts of, we look at thematic surveys, all different types of sites, mostly for two reasons. One is to make sure the best examples are scheduled or become listed buildings, but also to enhance our historic environment record, whole series of different sorts of sites. We publish reports, either popular publications or academic publications or a variety of both, of which we've produced huge numbers over the years. We have events, here's one event today, but also other types of events we've held and activities over the years, engaged with huge numbers of people. And finally, I'm sure many people in the audience recognise themselves here today. Without the volunteers we've engaged with and all their input they've had over the years, our work would just not have happened. So this is just a thanks to all these people and probably many thousands more who've actually made the work possible over the past 50 years. And at that point I shall finish. Thank you.